The night my daughter opened her restaurant, my son-in-law stood up in front of everyone. Family, friends, investors, the local newspaper reporter who'd driven 40 minutes from Raleigh, and said into the microphone that his family had made it all possible, that without his parents' belief in them, none of it would have happened. I was sitting at a table near the back, next to my sister Norma, holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched. My daughter was across the room, beaming in a burgundy dress I'd never seen before. She caught my eye for just a second, then she looked away. I smiled. I set down my glass, and I thought about the $340,000 I had wired from my retirement account 14 months earlier. My name is Beverly. No, that's on the list. Let me start over the way I always do when I tell this story, which is from the beginning, because the beginning matters more than people think. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina, the second of 4 children. My father worked at the textile mill. My mother cleaned houses 3 days a week and ours on the other 4. We weren't poor in the way that makes for dramatic stories, but we were careful. Every dollar was assigned a purpose before it arrived. That was just how life worked. I married young, 22, to a good man named Stuart who sold commercial insurance and coached Little League on Saturday mornings and never once raised his voice at me or our children in 31 years of marriage. We had 2 kids, our son, who lives in Portland now and calls every Sunday, and our daughter, Alicia. Alicia was the one who burned bright, always had been. She was the child who rearranged the living room furniture at age 9 because the flow was wrong, who taught herself to make croissants from a library book at 14, who took a gap year after high school to work in a restaurant kitchen in Asheville and came home with calluses on her hands and the clearest eyes I'd ever seen on her. "I want my own place, Mum," she told me when she was 24. "Not a chain, not someone else's concept. Mine." I believed her. I always believed her. Stuart died in the spring of her 29th year. A heart attack, sudden, no warning except the ones we hadn't known to look for. He was 61. I was 59. And the world became very quiet in a way I hadn't expected and couldn't prepare for. Alicia was there through all of it. She flew home from Asheville within 4 hours of my phone call and stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping in her old room, making sure I ate, sitting with me on the back porch in the evenings when the silence got too heavy. Her brother came too, of course, but he had young children and had to go back. Alicia stayed. I have never forgotten that. I should also say, because this matters, that Stuart left us well. He wasn't a wealthy man by any standard, but he was careful, the way his parents had taught him to be, the way I understood from my own upbringing. There was the house, paid off. There was a life insurance policy. There was a 401k that had grown steadily over 3 decades, because Stuart had never once raided it. Not when the roof needed replacing, not when Alicia's tuition came due. He believed in it the way some men believe in things they can't see but know are real. After the estate settled, I had a little under $900,000 in various accounts, not generational wealth, not nothing. I moved into a smaller place, a 2-bedroom condo in Cary, near the hospital where my primary care doctor was, near the grocery store I liked, near Norma, who had divorced her husband years ago and was my closest friend on earth. I was 60 years old, recently widowed, and for the first time in my adult life, I had money that was entirely mine to decide about. Alicia met her husband, I'll call him Brandon, about 8 months after Stuart died. She brought him to Thanksgiving that first year, this tall, confident man from Charlotte, whose family owned several car dealerships and who had the kind of ease with rooms full of people that I had always privately envied. He was charming. I want to be fair about that. He was genuinely charming. What I noticed even then was how quickly he began to have opinions about Alicia's dream. The margins in the restaurant business are brutal. he told me at that Thanksgiving helpfully while we stood near the dessert table. Most places fail in the first year. Alicia's talented, but talent isn't enough. She knows the business, I said. She knows the kitchen, he said. That's different. I smiled and excused myself to refill my water. They married 18 months later at a vineyard outside Chapel Hill. It was beautiful. I wore the navy dress Alicia had helped me pick out, and I danced with my son, and I thought, standing at the edge of the dance floor watching my daughter laugh, that Stuart would have cried at this. He cried at everything that mattered. Brandon's parents, his father Edwin and his mother Suzanne, were the kind of people who filled a room with the assumption that the room had been waiting for them. Edwin had built the dealership network from one lot outside Charlotte in the 1980s into something with 6 locations and a real estate arm. He shook hands firmly and complimented everything twice and believed, I think genuinely, that this made him generous. Suzanne wore jewelry that caught the light at every angle and referred to Alicia as our girl from about the 3rd time they met. I liked them fine. I want to be accurate about this. I did not dislike them. But I noticed, the way you notice a draft in a house before you find where it's coming from, that when Alicia's restaurant dream came up in conversation, Edwin had a way of nodding that meant he was already calculating. The conversation happened on a Tuesday in March, about 2 years into their marriage. Alicia drove to Cary, and we sat at my kitchen table with coffee, and she showed me the business plan. It was thorough. I had not expected anything less, but still, it was thorough. She had chosen a location in Durham, a neighborhood called the Warehouse District, that was mid-transition, the kind of block where a wine bar and a tire shop still existed within half a block of each other. She'd had a contractor walk through the space. She had projected startup costs at $380,000, with a conservative break-even at month 22. I've talked to the bank, she said. They'll do a commercial loan for about half, maybe 60% if the personal guarantee is strong. And the rest? She wrapped both hands around her mug. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. She did not ask me outright. Alicia was not that kind of person. She laid it out and she waited, and I looked at the projections and the photographs of the space and the menu sketches she'd done by hand in the margins of her notebook. And I thought about Stuart saying, "We do the things that matter while we still can." "What are Brandon's parents putting in?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "They offered," she said carefully. "Edwin wants a 20% equity stake." I looked at her. "I told him I'd think about it," she said. "And what does Brandon think?" "Brandon thinks his father is being generous." I understood the whole picture from those 2 sentences. I had been a mother for 34 years, and I knew my daughter's silences as well as her words. I told her I would think about it. I went to my financial advisor, a woman named Patricia. No, that name is on the list. I'll call her my advisor. I went to my financial advisor the following week, and we looked at my full picture together. I was 62. I had no immediate plans to retire from the part-time consulting work I still did. My expenses were modest. And I had a daughter with a real plan and a real dream and a real chance. I decided to contribute $340,000, not as an equity stake, not as a loan with interest, as a gift, her inheritance, early structured as a capital contribution with no strings attached and no ownership claim. I had one condition, that she keep the source private. I need to explain that decision, because I have seen enough now to know that it looks foolish from the outside, but it came from something real. I had watched Edwin's face when Alicia talked about the restaurant. I knew that the moment my name appeared in any financial document as a major contributor, that knowledge would become a tool. It would be my mother helped more, which would become your mother, controls this, which would become a lever in every disagreement they ever had about the business. I also, and this is harder to admit, I also did not want Brandon to know the exact size of what I had. I had seen how he filed that kind of information away. So the money moved through my attorney, structured as a gift to Alicia personally, and she used it as her capital contribution. No paper with my name near Brandon's father's name. No comparison to be made. Just the thing itself. Done. Alicia knew. She drove to Carrie the day the wire cleared, and she held my hands across the table and cried. I told her that her father would have done the same thing, and I believed that, and I believe it still. The restaurant opened on a Thursday evening in October. The place was called Fieldstone, her choice, from the Fieldstone foundation her grandfather had built a smokehouse on land in Alamance County that had been in my family for 3 generations. I had told her that story when she was maybe 10 years old, and I had forgotten I told it, and when she said the name I had to put my hand over my mouth. I was not on the guest list for the soft opening. I found out from Norma, who had seen a post on Alicia's social media. A private event, 40 guests, the kind of evening designed to generate word of mouth. My son called me from Portland that same week and mentioned it, trying to be careful, and I said, yes, I knew, and then I got off the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time. I told myself there were logistics I didn't understand, that Alicia was overwhelmed, that the guest list had been a compromise with Brandon's family, and my feelings were not more important than her success. I told myself these things for about 3 weeks. The grand opening was a different event, a Saturday evening in late November, catered with tables arranged for family and investors and local press. I was invited. I drove the 45 minutes to Durham, and I wore a deep green dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and I was seated at a table near the back of the room, next to Norma and a couple I didn't know who turned out to be friends of Edwin's from the Charlotte business community. Edwin and Suzanne were at the front table with Brandon and Alicia, and 2 of Brandon's siblings, and a man I recognized as the venture partner who had come in for the remaining equity after Alicia had declined Edwin's original terms. I remember looking at the table and doing the quiet math of it. Edwin had ended up with 12%. The venture partner had 10. Alicia held the majority, and somewhere, invisibly, was the $340,000 that had made the whole thing possible, attributed to no one, floating free. The food was extraordinary. It was Alicia at her absolute best, a roasted beet dish that I know I'm going to think about for the rest of my life, a short rib that tasted like something from a place that had existed for decades. I watched strangers take their first bites, and I felt proud in a way that had no vanity in it. That was pure. Then Brandon stood up. He had a glass of champagne and that ease he always carried in rooms, and he thanked the staff and he thanked the guests. And then he turned to the front table and his voice got warm, and he talked about his parents, about how Edwin and Suzanne had believed in this dream from the beginning, how their family support had made it real, how without them Fieldstone would not be standing. My family put this place on the map, he said, and he raised his glass, and Edwin nodded with that twice complimenting smile, and Suzanne touched her jewelry, and the room applauded. I sat very still. Norma's hand found mine under the table. Alicia was looking at her plate. Brandon did not mention me. He mentioned his college roommate who designed the logo. He mentioned the contractor by first name. He thanked the family support that made risk possible in a phrase so general it could mean anything and specifically meant his family. I had paid for 62% of the build out of the room he was standing in. I sat very still and I held Norma's hand and I smiled at the people around me who were applauding, and I thought, he doesn't know. That was the thing I kept returning to. Brandon didn't know. Alicia hadn't told him, which meant Alicia had let this happen. I drove home alone. I didn't call her that night. I needed to be still with it first. She called me Sunday morning. I let it go to voicemail. She called again in the afternoon, and I picked up. "Mom," she said. "Alicia." "I know." "Do you?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Brandon doesn't know the amount. He knows I had savings. He knows I used some of what Dad left me." "That's not what happened." "I know, Mum, but I couldn't." She stopped. "Edwin made it conditional. When I turned down his equity stake, there was a whole conversation. Brandon's loyalty is to his father first. I was trying to protect the business by letting me disappear from it." She didn't answer. "Alicia, I'm not angry about the credit. I'm not a person who needs to be thanked in a speech. But he stood up in that room and told everyone, 'Your dream happened because of his family. That's not a small thing.'" "I know." "You were looking at your plate." "I know, Mom." We talked for a long time. I will not pretend that conversation fixed everything. It didn't. But I understood by the end of it that my daughter was not a villain in this story. She was a woman who had built something real and was trying to hold it together inside a marriage where her husband's family had decided, very quietly, that their version of the story was the one that counted. That made me sad in a way that was different from the anger. Sadder, actually. What happened next I did not plan in the way the word plan implies intention. It was more that I'd always known certain things about my financial life, and I had, over the months since the restaurant opened, been reviewing them. The condo I lived in, I owned it outright. My car was paid for. I had a brokerage account and a Roth IRA and a money market account, and, as of 14 months earlier, a capital gains tax situation that my accountant had been gently mentioning for 2 consecutive appointments. I also had in my financial portfolio a stake in a small commercial real estate LLC that Stuart had invested in years ago and left to me. It wasn't large, about 4% of a retail strip in Ghana, but it had quietly appreciated, and my advisor had been suggesting for some time that it might be the right moment to exit. And there was one more thing. When I had gifted Alicia the money, my attorney had structured it simply, cleanly, with no ownership claim. But the gift had been contingent, per the documentation, on the venture maintaining a specific operational structure, a clause that had been Alicia's idea, actually, to protect against exactly the kind of outside pressure Edwin had applied. If the operational structure changed materially without my written consent, Alicia had agreed in writing to a right of first refusal conversation. The operational structure had changed, not dramatically, not obviously, but Brandon had, over the previous 6 months, moved the bookkeeping to a firm his father used, restructured the LLC in a way my attorney had flagged, and shifted 2 vendor contracts to companies with connections to Edwin's dealership network. I am not a dramatic woman. I did not arrive at Fieldstone with attorneys. I called my daughter. "I need us to sit down," I said, "with your attorney and mine, not because I want to cause problems, because I think there are some things that have moved without you fully seeing them." There was a long silence on the line. "Brandon's going to think this is about the speech," she said. "It's not about the speech. It's about your business, and I think you know that already, or you wouldn't have hired an attorney of your own last spring." Another silence. "How did you know about that?" "Norma mentioned you'd asked her for a referral. That's not the point. The point is that you saw something too, and I think we should look at it together." We met on a Wednesday morning in January, 4 months after the grand opening. My attorney, Alicia, and her attorney. Not Brandon, not Edwin. What came out of that meeting I won't detail entirely, because some of it is still private and some of it is still ongoing, and because Alicia asked me not to, and I respect that. What I will say is that the documentation my attorney laid out on that conference table, the original gift agreement, the operational structure clause, the vendor contract changes, the LLC restructuring, changed something in my daughter's face. She had not known about all of it. That was real. She had known about some of it and had looked away, which was also real and which she did not try to deny. I thought I could manage it, she said. I thought if I just kept the kitchen running well enough, the rest would stay outside. It doesn't work that way, her attorney said, not unkindly. I know that now. What changed practically? Alicia retained full control of Fieldstone by exercising provisions already in the original LLC agreement that the restructuring had tried to obscure. Brandon's father's informal advisory role, which had never been formalized but had been behaving as if it had, was ended in writing by certified letter. 2 vendor contracts were renegotiated. Brandon was not pleased. That is the most accurate way I can put it. He called me once from his cell phone at 8:30 on a Thursday evening. I let it ring. He left a voicemail that I have never deleted, not because I listened to it, but because my attorney told me to keep it. I want to be honest about what the aftermath looked like, because I have told this story to Norma and to my son and to my doctor, who is a thoughtful woman who asked good questions, and every time I get to the end, there's a temptation to make it tidier than it was. It was not tidy. Alicia and Brandon went to couples counseling, which I know because she told me. I don't know what happened in those rooms. I know that by the following spring she had moved to an apartment in Durham, that she found herself near the restaurant, and that she filed herself near the restaurant, and that she filed papers in April. She called me the night she filed, and we talked for 2 hours. She cried, and I did not say I told you so, and I did not say I knew, because neither of those things would have been true in the full sense, and because she was my daughter, and she was hurting, and that was the only thing that mattered. Fieldstone is still open. It got a mention in the regional food magazine in the summer. I have the issue in my kitchen, between the cookbooks, and the reviewer used the word assured to describe the cooking, which made me think of the 9-year-old who rearranged the living room furniture because the flow was wrong. Edwin came by the restaurant once, I'm told, about 2 months after the divorce papers were filed. He sat at the bar. He ordered a drink. He left without speaking to Alicia. I don't know what he was looking for. Maybe he just wanted to see it. I am 64 years old now. I live in my condo in Cary. I have a small vegetable garden on the balcony, tomatoes, basil, 1 pepper plant that has, against all reason, survived 2 winters. I consult 2 days a week for a non-profit that does workforce development, which gives me enough to do that retirement doesn't feel like erasure. On Sunday afternoons, when the weather is right, I drive to Durham, and I sit at the bar at Fieldstone, and I have a glass of wine, and whatever Alicia has decided to put on the menu that week. Sometimes we talk for an hour after service. Sometimes she's too tired and we just sit together and that's enough. She thanked me properly about 6 months after the meeting with the attorneys. Not in a grand gesture way, in the way Alicia does things, which is quietly and directly and exactly when she means it. We were sitting on my balcony with coffee, and she said, I've been thinking about what you did. Not just the money, the way you did it, and why. I didn't want it to be a weapon, I said. I know, she said. That's the part I've been thinking about. I don't know if I made all the right choices. I know I made choices I understood, for reasons I could explain, in service of someone I loved. And I know that the thing I built, not the restaurant, but the quiet, load-bearing financial life that made it possible, held. Stuart would have understood that. He believed, the way I do, that the most important things you do for your children are often the ones they never see, until one day they're sitting across from you on a balcony in the morning light, holding their coffee with both hands, and you can see from the way they're looking at you that they finally do. I have thought a lot about the night my son-in-law stood up in that room and erased me from the story. Not dramatically, not with cruelty in his eyes, just with the casual confidence of someone who had decided a long time ago which version of events was going to be the one that counted. And I've thought about the fact that I sat there and let it happen. Smiled, even. Held Norma's hand under the table. Drove home alone. People sometimes ask me if I regret keeping the money quiet, if I should have made sure my name was on something, somewhere, so this couldn't have happened. And I understand why they ask. It looks from a distance like I handed someone the means to diminish me. But here's what I've come to understand about that choice, and about a lot of choices I've made in my 64 years. The things we do from a place of genuine love don't stop being right just because someone else misuses them. I kept my contribution private because I understood the dynamics I was walking into. I had watched Edwin long enough to know that money, in that family, was a language of control. I didn't want my daughter's dream to be built on a foundation where every disagreement could be traced back to who put in more. That wasn't naivety, that was judgment. It cost me a seat at a table I had largely paid for, and I would make the same call again. What I would do differently, and I mean this as plainly as I can, is that I would have talked to Alicia sooner. Not about the money, about what I was seeing. I watched Brandon file away information about our finances like a man who was keeping score, and I told myself it wasn't my business, that she was a grown woman, that intervening would only push her away. There is a version of staying quiet that comes from wisdom, and a version that comes from fear. I confused them for too long. The thing that actually held, the thing that didn't break even when everything else got complicated, was the work I had done years before any of this happened. Stuart and I had built something careful and steady, not because we were afraid of the world, but because we understood that the capacity to act freely when the moment required it comes from decisions made long before the moment arrives. You cannot be present for your children in the ways that matter most if you have no standing to stand on. I think about that a lot now, in a way I couldn't have articulated when I was 35 and exhausted and just trying to get through the week. The quiet, unglamorous work of building something that holds, that is not a lesser form of love. It is, in a lot of ways, the deepest form, because it requires you to think past your own desire to be seen, to be thanked, to have your name on the door. It requires you to care more about what your child actually has than about what anyone in a room knows you gave. Alicia sat across from me on my balcony last spring holding her coffee, and she said, "I've been thinking about what you did, not just the money, the way you did it." And I thought, that is the whole thing, right there. Not the amount, the way, the intention behind the structure, the willingness to do something real and ask nothing back from it except that it hold. That's what I want to carry forward, not the hurt of that evening, that faded faster than I expected, but the clarity it gave me about what I actually believe, about what it means to love someone well, and about the kind of woman I still have time to be.